In this video, I'm going to reveal to you 10 deadly grocery store items that you need to know about. Now, these are not uncommon or unusual items that I'm going to share with you in this video. They're actually pretty normal, everyday items that should be in your pantry. They should be a part of your stockpile, but if they're not handled correctly, if they're not stored correctly, or if you store them in the wrong amounts, they're going to cause major problems for you. So we've got to talk about what these items are, give you some hacks for how to handle this so that you have peace of mind in that survival situation and you don't have preps on your shelves that end up actually becoming a major problem. All of that is coming up. All right, guys, so when it comes to being prepared, you need to have grocery store items on your shelves, in your pantry, ready to go, right? But if you have the wrong items or they're stored in the wrong way, you're going to end up with this, a warning that these 10 deadly grocery store items, they can be deadly when they're stockpiled wrong. So as we dive into the Reddit threads on this topic, which we do on this channel every time that we jump on, we find that there's a lot of common advice around what should not be stockpiled or what's being stockpiled incorrectly, right? And so what rose to the surface on this thread was that food that can spoil needs to be handled correctly. So we're going to talk about that here in just a minute, some specific food items and elements of cooking that if you don't store them correctly or you don't store them in the right quantities, they're going to cause major problems. So food that can spoil, maybe that's an obvious one. Here's an unusual one you might not have expected to come out of this thread, and that's explosive items. And so there's actually items that when you store them, if you store them improperly, they can actually have a potential for exploding, and then some, as I talked about, can actually cause suffocation. So we need to talk about what those items are. How do you store them correctly so that they're not causing you major problems? Let's look at these top 10 items. So number 10 on the list is baking soda. Baking soda is just an all-around amazing prep item that you're going to want to have, right? Because why would that be dangerous? Why would that be a problem to stockpile that, right? But it's so helpful because it can be used in household cleaning. It can be used for deodorizing, obviously for baking. And so sometimes people might just stock up a lot of baking soda because it's so multi-purpose. It's got so many uses to it, right? But the problem is that when it's stored in large quantities and it's stored in an airtight environment, it can actually release carbon dioxide gas, displace the oxygen, and potentially lead to suffocation in the space that it's in if it's not properly ventilated. So you need to store the right quantities of baking soda, right? So make sure you store it in a cool, dry place with adequate ventilation and avoid excessive amounts. So although it's got multi-purpose, can be used in lots of ways, don't store too much of it because it can actually end up causing a problem. So make sure that you have a small hole in it as well to avoid that pressure buildup. So that's number 10. Number 9, flour. Flour is another item. You're going to have this on your shelves in your pantry, right? How could something as harmless as flour be a hazard? Well, flour is that staple ingredient. It's got to be in your kitchen, right? Because there's so many things you can cook, but it can also harbor harmful bacteria like salmonella, like E. coli, if it's not stored properly. And it also attracts pests. It attracts insects and rodents, and all of that can contaminate and spread disease. So when you're stockpiling flour in large quantities, if you leave it undisturbed for too long, it can actually become a breeding ground for pests or bacteria. So that's why you've got to watch this. So practically, store flour in an airtight container and rotate your stock regularly. It's not bad to store up a lot of flour, but you've got to make sure that you keep eyes on it. And you're going to keep it in a cool, dry place and inspect it regularly for signs of pests, for spoilage, and then, of course, just as you're using it, discard any that appears discolored, has an off odor, or shows signs of infestation. Number 8 may surprise you. Honey is on the list. And so it's a natural preservative. A lot of us know that, right? So why would it be dangerous to stockpile honey? It's actually known for its long shelf life, and that's because of those natural preservatives. But when it's stored in an airtight container, an airtight environment, it can ferment. And it begins to produce carbon dioxide gas, and that can build up inside the container, and then again, it can burst, which can cause harm to others if they're around that at that time, and also causes a huge mess. So what's the practical hack here? Store honey in a cool, dry place. Make sure to leave a little bit of headspace in whatever container you're keeping it in, and then that allows for the gas release. And then consider storing honey in smaller containers, smaller jars, and that's going to minimize the potential for that pressure buildup. Number 7 is canned foods. We're all going to have canned foods on our shelf, right? We've got to have them on there, and they're actually designed for long-term storage. So what could go wrong with canned foods? You've got to have canned foods, right? They're actually made for this. The problem is, although they're a convenient, great storage option, they can be stored improperly, or they can get dented, and that leads to a lot of storage issues. So exposure to heat, to moisture, extreme temperatures, all these things can cause the cans themselves to rust, to swell, and then that could even lead to botulism, which is crazy. So then that can lead to all of these problems can lead to a clear contamination in the can itself, and then you should not consume it. So how do you handle this? You've got to handle this by storing them in a cool, dry spot away from direct sunlight. So sunlight is your enemy. Heat source is your enemy when it comes to canned foods. You want controlled temperature, controlled conditions. So a way to handle this is you're just going to have to inspect the cans regularly for signs of rust, for swelling, for leakage, and discard the compromised cans. And then also, this is really helpful, if you don't already have a FIFO system, first in, first out, make sure that you're rotating new cans of food that you're buying at the supermarket to the back and moving them forward to the front so that you don't end up with items sitting there for too long on the shelves. Number 6 is vegetable oil. So vegetable oil is a pantry staple. How could it become dangerous, right? Vegetable oils, they're commonly used in cooking, for baking, but when they're stockpiled in large quantities, they can actually pose a fire hazard. So over time, vegetable oils, they become rancid, believe it or not, and they begin to release flammable vapors that can ignite, and if they're exposed to an open flame or a heat source, become a huge problem. So the rancid oils also can produce an unpleasant odor, and they makes your flavors and everything taste terrible, and they're going to be unsuitable for consumption. So store vegetable oil in cool, dark places. Again, you're going to want a temperature-controlled environment for a lot of these preps that we're talking about today. Use airtight containers or bottles to minimize exposure to air and prolong shelf life. Rotate your stock regularly and discard any oil. You're going to want to use the smell test immediately. If it smells off or tastes rancid, just discard it all. It's not worth it. All right, so number 5 is rice. Rice is a commonly talked about prep, right? Everybody who's in the prepping community talks about rice. It's so key. It has a long shelf life, so what could possibly be the danger with storing up rice? And you're right, it is versatile. It's affordable. It can last for long periods of time, but if it's stored improperly, it does lead to issues. And so it can't be stored in damp or humid conditions because then it becomes a breeding ground for mold, for bacteria, and can cause foodborne illnesses if it's consumed. So, and there's also the same kind of issue again with pests, insects, rodents, all of those kinds of things. So store rice in airtight containers in a cool, dry place, and consider adding a few bay leaves, cool tip, or food-grade desiccants to the container to help absorb moisture and prevent spoilage. And if you do all of that, plus inspecting for signs of pests, mold, discoloration, you should be good when it comes to rice. Again, rice is going to be a long-term prep. You just have to make sure you store it properly. Okay, let's talk about number 4, which is vinegar. And vinegar, it's a preservative, right? So how could it be dangerous when you're stockpiling it? That's a strange idea. And you're right, it is versatile. It's again, like baking soda, a household item used for cooking, for cleaning, for pickling, right? But if it's stored improperly, vinegar can corrode metal containers that it's in and can produce harmful vapors. And the acetic acid in vinegar, it reacts with certain metals and it causes corrosion. And all of that is not good, right? Because it can lead to potentially problems when consumed or when you're around it if inhaled in high concentrations. So practically, you want to store vinegar in glass or plastic containers, not metal. And again, in a cool, dry place, you're probably seeing that theme, away from direct sunlight, away from heat sources, and avoid storing vinegar in metal containers. If you do store it in large quantities, just make sure there's proper ventilation and minimize exposure to those vapors. Number 3 is alcohol, and so we're talking about whether it is whether we're talking about rubbing alcohol or liquor. It is flammable, and this is where you can get into a fire hazard if you stockpile in large quantities in the wrong way. The vapors from alcohol, they also can be combustible. They can ignite if they're not properly stored and unsealed, right? So large quantities, they can lead to spills, to leaks, and create a huge fire hazard if you don't store them right. So when it comes to alcohol, you're going to make sure that you store it in a cool, dry place, again, away from heat sources. Heat is not your friend, and temperature controlled is, right? So away from open flames and away from direct sunlight, and use airtight containers to minimize vapor release. And so just make sure you don't store too much, because it can actually begin to become a problem if it's stored too much. It can last a long time, but just make sure that you have proper ventilation and keep it stored in the correct way, right? All right, so let's talk about hydrogen peroxide, and it's a huge, just important piece of part of your stockpile, because it's a household cleaner, can help with cuts and scrapes, right? And so it can also be a disinfectant and a bleaching agent, household cleaning, personal care, lots of applications for this one, right? But if it's stored in large quantities or stored improperly, it can become unstable, and that releases oxygen gas that causes the containers to burst, to leak. And that's a huge mess that you got to clean up, and then also a respiratory hazard. So when it comes to this one, the practical hack is storing this in a cool, dark place away from heat sources and sunlight again, and you're going to want to make sure that it's in opaque containers. That's going to make sure that the light isn't getting in. And in a dark cabinet to minimize light exposure. All of those things are going to actually accelerate the degradation of it and actually make it unuseful. So make sure to just regularly check it and check the bottle if it's swollen or discolored. All right, so that leads us to number one, and that is laundry detergent. And it's a necessity. We've got to have some sort of laundry detergent, right, to be able to keep our clothes clean in our everyday life in a survival situation. So how could that be dangerous? Well, it contains high concentration of oxidizers, such as sodium percarbonate or hydrogen peroxide, which can become a fire hazard. And so if it's stockpiled in large quantities, that's a huge problem. And it can react to organic materials, other chemicals, and it can release spontaneous combustion or toxic fumes. So when it comes to storing laundry detergent, like so many preps on this list, you're going to want to make sure to store it in a cool, dry place away from heat sources, open flames, and direct sunlight. So that is the common theme in this list. In these 10 items that you're going to want to make sure that you're going to want to make sure that you have most of these things in your stockpile on your shelves, but make sure that you store them in a temperature-controlled environment without direct sunlight so that you don't end up in a hazardous situation. And so hopefully all that's helpful. If you've got another item that you would say, man, we've got to watch out for this, make sure to leave that in the comments below. Leave a like on this video, and we will see you guys next time.